On the morning of September the 17th, 1858, the hunting dogs of the Bellwether plantation returned alone from the lowland swamp bordering the Mississippi River. There were 4 of them, and according to the overseer's own account, later summarized in a county ledger held for decades in a courthouse annex, they arrived at the kennel gate before sunrise, their coats matted with black mud, their tongues raw, their bodies trembling as though they had swum for hours rather than walked. Around the neck of each animal, someone had tied a narrow strip of blue cloth, knotted twice, the fabric soaked through and beginning to fray at the edges. The dogs would not approach the swamp again for the remainder of that season, according to a note left by the kennel keeper, who wrote only that the animals balked at the tree line and would not be driven past it. The woman the dogs had been sent to find did not return with them. She was 22 years old, enslaved on the property, and recorded in the plantation's daily ledger only as Ruth. No trace of her was found that day, nor in the weeks that followed, though a search was said to have continued informally among a handful of men for several days after the official effort ended. The overseer, a man named Silas Perrine, told the plantation's owner, Nathaniel Bellwether, that the woman had most likely drowned in one of the deep channels that cut through the swamp during the autumn rains, places the local watermen called sinkholes, though no body was ever recovered from any of them, and no one on the property could recall a prior instance of a person drowning in that particular stretch of water. Despite this, Perrin gave an order before noon that no further search be conducted. By the following evening, according to testimony gathered decades later from a woman who had worked in the plantation kitchen as a girl, Ruth's few belongings, a wooden comb, a folded piece of cloth, and a tin cup, had been carried behind the smokehouse and burned. Her name was struck from the plantation's labor book with a single diagonal line, the same mark used elsewhere in that ledger to record livestock sold or deceased. Neighboring households and workers on adjoining properties received word, delivered informally through overseers and a traveling church deacon, that the matter was considered settled and was not to be raised again, in company or otherwise. What did not fit, and what would trouble a researcher decades later, was the cloth. Blue strips of that particular weave were not standard equipment for tracking dogs anywhere in the parish, and no supply record, invoice, or merchant's receipt from the county accounted for their purchase. And yet 4 dogs had returned wearing them, tied by hands that were never identified, in a knot that the kennel keeper himself said he did not recognize as any pattern used on the property. Before the disappearance, the Bellwether plantation had functioned by outward appearance, much like its neighbors along that stretch of the river. Nathaniel Bellwether had inherited the property from his father in 1841, and had expanded it steadily through the following decade, acquiring adjoining parcels of land near the community that would later be known as St. Mercy, a scattering of a few dozen households built around a wooden church and a ferry landing on a bend of a tributary creek. The plantation grew cotton and some sugarcane, and its household ledgers, later recovered in fragments from a courthouse basement, describe a workforce of just under 60 people, their names, approximate ages, and occasionally their particular skills, recorded in a hand that changed several times over the years, suggesting more than one clerk had kept the books at different periods. Ruth appears in these ledgers first, in 1850, listed as a house servant of 14 years of age, assigned to assist with correspondence and household accounts. According to a deposition given many years afterward by a woman who had once worked in the same house, Ruth possessed an unusual gift for numbers and for copying words exactly as they appeared on a page, a skill she was said to have developed while helping sort the plantation's commercial mail, a task that would ordinarily have been reserved for a literate clerk rather than an enslaved girl. It was this ability, several of the surviving fragments suggest, that would come to matter more, in the end, than anyone at the time understood. The household itself was not without its own quiet fractures, the kind rarely recorded directly but visible at the edges of surviving correspondence. Letters between Nathaniel Bellwether and his brother-in-law, a merchant based farther upriver, preserved among later archival material, describe disputes over debts, over premiums paid on insurance policies covering human property, and over what one letter vaguely calls adjustments to the labor inventory, adjustments never itemized in any surviving financial statement. The same correspondence shows Bellwether requesting, on more than one occasion, that his brother-in-law arrange for the transport of certain unnamed individuals to buyers at a distance, a phrase that appears repeatedly across several letters without ever being clarified further, and which later researchers would come to read as a coded reference to the very scheme Ruth eventually uncovered. A local minister's private notebook, discovered decades afterward among a box of parish papers stored in a courthouse annex alongside other unrelated county records, records a brief conversation in which Bellwether is said to have complained that too many of his workers had grown, in the minister's paraphrase, restless of late, though the minister did not specify what this restlessness involved or whether it referred to a single individual or many. The same notebook, in an entry from several weeks earlier, describes the minister's own discomfort at being asked by Bellwether to sign a document attesting to the sound moral character of a buyer to whom several individuals from the property were to be transferred that season, an unusual request the minister noted he had fulfilled against some private reservation, without elaborating on what that reservation had been, or whether he had ever raised it with anyone else. Other entries in the same notebook describe a woman on the property, unnamed but matching Ruth's approximate age, who had begun asking a local schoolmaster's wife in the course of delivering mended linens, small and seemingly idle questions about how figures were recorded in a merchant's account book, and how a name, once written down, might later be changed. The schoolmaster's wife apparently found the questions strange enough to mention them to her husband, though neither appears to have thought them significant enough to report further. Testimony gathered decades later from the granddaughter of a woman who had once cooked in the plantation kitchen offers a fuller, if second-hand, picture of Ruth's daily life in the years before her disappearance. According to this account, Ruth shared a small room above the kitchen with an older woman named Delphine, who had raised her since childhood after Ruth's own mother was sold to a property upriver in 1846. Delphine is described in this testimony as having taught Ruth to read simple words from a discarded primer years before it would have been permitted on the property, an act the household appears never to have discovered or chose not to record if it did. The two women are said to have kept a small garden plot behind the kitchen, tended in the earliest hours of the morning before the household woke, growing herbs used both for cooking and, according to the same testimony, for treating minor ailments among the workers when no other remedy was available to them. It was Delphine, by this account, who first grew uneasy in the summer of 1858, noticing that Ruth had begun rising even earlier than usual, and returning to their shared room with her hands stained faintly with ink she could not easily explain. Delphine is said to have asked no direct questions, but to have begun without comment, setting aside small amounts of dried food and a second pair of shoes in a corner of their room. The granddaughter offering this testimony said only that her own grandmother had always described this period as the quiet before the quiet, a phrase she admitted she had never fully understood herself, though she repeated it exactly as she remembered it having been told to her. The trigger, as later research would reconstruct it, appears to have come sometime in the late summer of 1858. Ruth, in the course of her clerical duties, is believed to have come across correspondence and account entries that did not align with the plantation's public records. According to notes later attributed to her under a different name, recovered many decades afterward, she began quietly copying portions of these documents onto loose pages, folding them into the lining of a hymn book she kept for herself. A book belonging to the small congregation that met irregularly near the property's edge, in a structure that would later become the church at St. Mercy. What the documents described, once reconstructed generations later, was a scheme involving Nathaniel Bellwether, several regional merchants, at least 2 insurance agents operating out of a river port some distance downstream, and, according to one contested account given long after the fact, a magistrate connected to the county seat, enslaved individuals identified as likely to attempt escape or judged too costly to continue maintaining were quietly recorded as dead, missing, or sold to distant, difficult-to-trace buyers. In practice, some were secretly transported and resold under new names in other states. Others never left the region at all, but were moved between properties owned by relatives of the Bellwether family, their identities altered in every surviving document that touched them. Through this arrangement, Bellwether is believed to have collected insurance payments on individuals recorded as deceased, erased debts tied to specific names, and severed any documented family or ownership connections that might later have been used to demonstrate a claim, whether of kinship, of a prior sale, or of wrongdoing on the part of the estate. The mechanics of the arrangement, as later reconstructed from the copied pages and cross-referenced against surviving insurance and probate records from the period, appear to have relied on a deliberate mismatch between the documents kept for public and legal purposes and those kept privately by Bellwether himself. A policy taken out on an individual's life, for instance, might list an age or physical description subtly different from the same individual's entry in the plantation's own labor book, a discrepancy small enough to escape casual notice, but large enough, once identified, to demonstrate that the 2 records could not describe the same transaction honestly. One insurance claim recovered decades later by researchers cross-referencing court records lists a payout made in the autumn of 1858 for a woman recorded as having drowned, a date and description that aligned closely, though not perfectly, with Ruth's own case, though whether this specific claim relates to her directly or to another woman processed through the same scheme has never been conclusively established. Ruth had copied names, approximate dates, and destinations from at least a portion of this arrangement, working, according to later testimony, in the hours after the household had gone to sleep, by the light of a single candle kept low enough not to be seen from the yard. She understood, the same testimony suggests, that she herself was soon to be transferred to another property under an unfamiliar name. A fate that would have severed her from everyone she knew and erased permanently the record of who she had once been. It was at this point, sometime in the 2nd week of September, that she disappeared into the swamp. St. Mercy itself, as it existed in this period, sat along a bend of a tributary creek, some 4 miles from the main channel of the Mississippi, close enough to the river to flood in wet years, but far enough inland to escape the worst of it. The community's few dozen households were scattered along a single unpaved road, connecting a small general store, a ferry landing used mainly for moving cotton bales to the river barges, and the wooden church where Evelyn Carter would later spend her months of research. A modest cemetery adjoined the church, its older markers, according to Evelyn's own inventory of the grounds, worn nearly smooth by weather, several bearing no name at all, only a set of initials or a single carved cross. Evelyn noted in her records that she had searched this cemetery carefully during her first week in the parish, hoping to find some marker connected to Ruth, and had found nothing, a fact she recorded without surprise, given what she would later learn about how thoroughly the plantation had erased every other trace of the woman's presence. The Bellwether property itself lay roughly 2 miles further along the same road, its fields visible from a rise near the church. On clear days, The big house set back from the road behind a line of oaks planted, according to family correspondence, by Nathaniel Bellwether's father in the 1820s. A scattering of smaller structures, the kitchen, the smokehouse, the overseer's cabin, and the rows of workers' quarters, stood between the house and the fields, arranged, as on most plantations of the period, so that the owner's residence commanded a clear view over all of it. The community's explanation, delivered swiftly and with unusual uniformity, was that she had drowned. This account served several purposes at once. It absolved the plantation of any obligation to continue a search that might have drawn unwanted attention from neighboring landowners. It discouraged further inquiry into why 4 dogs had returned exhausted and marked with cloth no one on the property could explain, and it allowed the household ledger to be closed with a single line, no different in form from the line drawn through the name of a mule that had broken a leg the previous winter and been destroyed. Neighboring plantation owners, according to a handful of surviving letters exchanged that autumn, appear to have accepted the explanation without particular scrutiny, several expressing in their correspondence a general weariness with the subject of runaways that season. One letter noting that 3 other properties in the parish had lost workers to flight or disappearance within the same few months. A detail that, taken together with Ruth's case, suggests the practice Bellwether was engaged in may not have been confined to his own property alone, though no surviving document connects the other cases directly to his scheme. A travelling preacher who passed through St. Mercy that October is recorded in the diary kept by a member of his congregation as having offered a brief prayer for the lost soul of the swamp during a Sunday service. A gesture the diarist noted was met with unusual silence from the plantation household members present, several of whom, she wrote, kept their eyes fixed on the floor throughout, as though the words themselves might be dangerous to look up during. In the years that followed, according to fragments of correspondence and a handful of preserved diaries kept by families in the area, the region around the Bellwether property fell into what one diarist described in an entry dated to 1863 as a heaviness that sits over the low fields even in good weather that no one troubles to explain. The smokehouse where Ruth's belongings had been burned was itself destroyed by fire in 1866, under circumstances a county fire report describes only as of undetermined origin, a phrase that appears, on inspection of the surrounding pages, unusually often in that particular ledger. The original plantation house was sold outside the family in 1871 and stood largely empty for the following 3 decades, its windows boarded, its garden overtaken by kudzu and wild cane, its rooms, according to a passing traveller's letter from 1884, smelling faintly of river damp, even in the dry months. The same traveller noted that the local family hosting him for the night had gone somewhat out of their way to route their evening walk around the property rather than past it, a detour of perhaps 20 minutes that no one in the party remarked upon or explained, though he wrote that he had noticed it all the same and had not thought it his place to ask why. Visitors to the area during this long interval, according to a handful of surviving letters and a single travel diary kept by an itinerant land surveyor, remarked on an unusual silence among the older residents whenever the name Bellwether or the subject of the old plantation's missing workers arose in conversation. Several accounts describe this silence not as forgetfulness, but as something closer to an agreement, unspoken but universally observed, the kind that requires no enforcement because everyone already understands its terms. One such account, dated to 1883, describes a man named Elias Foy, a former levee labourer who had worked briefly on the Bellwether property as a young man before moving away to find steadier wages, returning to the region after more than 20 years to attend his mother's burial. According to a brief mention in a relative's letter, Foy spent an afternoon walking the old drainage ditch at the edge of the former cotton fields, a route he said, without explaining why, that he had wanted to see again before he left. He is said to have returned from this walk carrying a single object, a small brass button of a style not used on any garment issued to workers on the property, which he showed to no one but his mother's sister, and which he refused, when asked, to say where exactly he had found it. The button was kept afterward in a tin box by the family for a number of years, and is mentioned once more, in passing, in a letter from 1891, before it disappears from the surviving record entirely. The surveyor mentioned above, working through the parish in 1889 to update boundary records, noted in his diary that he had asked a ferryman directly about a Ruth's Passage, marked informally on a hand-drawn chart lent to him by a local fisherman, and that the ferryman had answered only that it had always been called that, offering nothing further. Though the surveyor noted the man's hands had stopped moving on the oar for a moment before he resumed rowing. What almost no one in the wider community knew, though later research would confirm it through independent testimony gathered from multiple unconnected sources, was that Ruth had not drowned. She had been guided through the swamp by a free black boatman named Isaiah Cole, 46 years old at the time, who transported lumber, mail, and goods between isolated river settlements, and who was known, among a small circle of watermen, fishermen and levee labourers, to understand the hidden channels that opened only during low tide, channels that appeared on no official survey of the parish, and were passed down by necessity only through direct instruction from one boatman to another. Isaiah kept no written record of these routes, according to his granddaughter's later testimony, because a map could be taken from a man, but a memory could not easily. The blue strips of cloth tied to the dogs' necks were, according to testimony gathered much later from descendants of river workers in the area, a signal used among this loose network of boatmen and levee hands to indicate that a pursuit had been successfully redirected. A system developed, it seems, over years of quiet cooperation that left almost no documentary trace of its own existence. The dogs, according to the same testimony, had been led along paths deliberately saturated with the scent of fish, damp tobacco, and clothing worn by several different people in succession, a method intended to fracture the animal's sense of a single, continuous trail. Whoever tied the cloth to their necks afterward and turned them back toward the plantation understood the animals well enough to know they would return home rather than continue circling a scent they could no longer follow. Isaiah Cole himself, according to testimony given by his granddaughter to the same 1960s folklore researcher mentioned elsewhere in this account, had been born free in 1812 to a mother who had purchased her own freedom decades earlier through years of hired-out labor as a laundress. He had worked the river and its side channels since he was a boy, first for his uncle and later on his own account, building a reputation among white merchants as reliable and unremarkable, a reputation his granddaughter said he had cultivated deliberately, so that no one would ever think to look twice at where his boat had been the night before. He is said to have assisted a number of people beyond Ruth over the course of his life, though his granddaughter maintained that he never spoke of any of it directly, even to his own family, and that most of what she knew she had pieced together only after his death, from a handful of remarks made by others who had known him on the water. When the dogs arrived at the kennel gate exhausted and marked, Bellwether is said, in the minister's notebook, to have gone very quiet for the better part of a day, a detail the minister recorded without further comment, and which a later researcher would come to read as evidence that Bellwether understood immediately that Ruth's escape had not been improvised, but organized by people who knew exactly what they were doing. What can be reconstructed of the crossing itself comes only in fragments, drawn from testimony given by descendants of the Cyprus Island communities 2 and 3 generations removed from anyone who might have witnessed it directly, and it is offered here with that caution attached. According to this testimony, Ruth left the plantation on foot some time after the household had gone quiet, carrying nothing that would have been missed the following morning, the folded pages from the hymn book bound against her body beneath her clothing. She is said to have walked first along a drainage ditch used by field hands during the harvest, a route that left no clear footprint in the hardened summer clay before reaching a stand of cypress where Isaiah Cole was waiting with a flat-bottomed boat poled rather than rowed, so as to make no sound that would carry across open water. The swamp itself, according to these accounts, was crossed mostly in darkness and largely in silence, the only sounds those already native to the place: water moving against root systems, insects, the occasional call of a night bird disturbed by the boat's passage. Isaiah is said to have known which channels ran deep enough to pole through and which would strand a boat by midnight. Knowledge he is said to have tested and revised over years of legitimate lumber runs made for hire. At 2 points along the route, according to the same testimony, the boat was met briefly by other men, unnamed even in the accounts passed down through families, who exchanged some object or word with Isaiah before withdrawing again into the trees, an arrangement the descendants describe only as the way it was done, without further detail, either because none was ever given to them or because none has survived being repeated across 60 or more years of retelling. By the time the search dogs were released the following morning, several hours had already passed. Whatever ground Ruth and Isaiah had covered by then, the descendants' testimony maintains, was already beyond anything the dogs could meaningfully retrace, regardless of the scent trails later laid down to further confuse them. The greater mystery, and the one that occupied nearly 5 decades of local rumor without ever settling into a single accepted account, concerned what became of the young woman afterward. It was this mystery that drew the attention, in the spring of 1907, of a schoolteacher and amateur researcher named Evelyn Carter, a black woman of 38 years, who arrived in St. Mercy to organize the records of a small church building scheduled for demolition later that year to make way for a new levee road. Evelyn's stated purpose was genealogical. She was searching for documentation of her own family's history in the parish, a task made unusually difficult by the fragmentary and often deliberately inconsistent record-keeping practiced on plantations throughout the region before the war. Records that frequently listed the same individual under different names in different books, depending on which ledger and whose purposes it had been compiled to serve. Before beginning her work at the church, Evelyn spent the better part of a week at the parish courthouse, working through what remained of the old plantation ledgers under the supervision of a clerk who, according to her own later notes, seemed more curious about why a schoolteacher wanted access to such material than inclined to assist her in finding it. She copied entries by hand into a series of small notebooks she had brought for the purpose, cross-referencing names, ages, and sale dates across several different volumes, a method she had developed, she wrote, after finding that no single ledger could be trusted on its own to tell a complete or consistent story. It was during this week, before she had even reached the church, that she first noted the discrepancy between the entries for a woman called Rebecca and one called Rachel, a discrepancy she set aside at the time as an ordinary clerical inconsistency, not yet suspecting how directly it would come to matter. Evelyn spent the better part of 2 weeks working through boxes of parish papers stored in a back room of the church, cataloguing baptismal records, burial notices, and correspondence between successive ministers, most of it unremarkable. What she found, instead of her own family's history, tucked inside the lining of an old hymn book stored in a cabinet at the rear of the building, was a set of stitched pages containing names, approximate ages, physical descriptions, and hand-drawn diagrams of routes through the swamp. The ink faded to a soft brown in places, but still legible in most. Evelyn's own account of the discovery, preserved in a letter to a cousin written some weeks later, describes the hymn book as unremarkable in every outward respect. Its cover cracked, its spine repaired at some point with a strip of cloth similar in weave, she noted with some unease upon later reflection, to the blue strips found on the dogs decades earlier, though she was careful to say she could not confirm any connection between the two beyond the coincidence itself. She wrote that she had nearly returned the book to its shelf without opening it fully, and had done so only because a loose thread along the inside cover caught against her thumb as she moved to close it. Among dozens of entries written in a cramped, careful hand, one name recurred with unusual frequency, always rendered in the same blue-black ink, as though written by the same person at different times over many years. Ruth Bellwether. This detail troubled Evelyn from the outset because the surviving plantation ledgers, which she had already examined at the parish courthouse during an earlier stage of her research, contained no record of any woman by that name. The financial books listed a laborer called Rebecca, recorded as sold in 1858, while the family's private inventory recorded a woman named Rachel, said to have died of fever that same year. When Evelyn laid the two entries side by side and compared the physical descriptions attached to each, height, approximate age, a small mark on the right hand, she found them to be nearly identical in every detail but the name. It appeared to her, and later research would support the conclusion, that the names had been deliberately swapped and duplicated, producing two official but incompatible versions of a single person. A method that would make it extremely difficult for any future investigator, however careful, to reconstruct who she had truly been, or to connect any of her descendants, should they exist, back to a single verifiable identity. Evelyn's own notes from this stage of the research described the moment of comparison in some detail. She wrote that she had spread both ledger pages on the same table beneath the church's single working window, weighting the corners with stones from the yard to keep the wind from disturbing them, and that it had taken her most of an afternoon, reading each entry aloud to herself, before she was certain the two descriptions could not reasonably belong to different women. She noted, with evident unease, that whoever had constructed the two entries had done so with some skill, choosing details specific enough to appear authentic in each separate record, but never specific enough, taken alone, to invite comparison with the other. Evelyn's research over the following months, conducted largely through interviews with elderly residents of St. Mercy and correspondence with distant relatives of former plantation workers scattered as far as Memphis and New Orleans, produced a set of contradictory accounts that refused to settle into agreement. Several older residents maintained that the missing woman had died within weeks of her disappearance, consistent with the plantation's original explanation, an account repeated with a uniformity that Evelyn, in her own private notes, described as suspicious in itself. Others insisted, with equal conviction, that a woman calling herself Rose Bennett had lived for several decades afterward as a seamstress in New Orleans, dying by this account only in the previous decade. A marriage record Evelyn eventually located for a Rose Bennett described a scar on the right hand, a detail that matched a runaway advertisement Nathaniel Bellwether had placed in a regional newspaper shortly after the disappearance, an advertisement Evelyn found reproduced in fragmentary form in a bound volume of old newspapers kept at the courthouse, offering a modest payment for information leading to the recovery of a woman it described in terms general enough to fit a great many people and specific enough in the matter of the scar to fit very few. However, Evelyn also discovered that the surname Bennett appeared attached to at least 3 different women in surviving records from roughly the same period, each with slightly different ages and circumstances. One a laundress in Baton Rouge, another recorded only in a single church baptismal entry with no further trace afterward, suggesting the name had been shared deliberately among several individuals as a means of confusing anyone, official or otherwise, attempting to trace a single fugitive back through the years. In her notes from this period, Evelyn wrote that she had begun to suspect the confusion was not accidental, that someone, or several someones, had built it on purpose, the way a bricklayer builds a false wall to hide a room behind it. Time in this middle stretch of her investigation passed slowly and without evident progress. Evelyn wrote to several archives, waited months for replies that often contradicted one another, and made 2 trips to New Orleans that produced little beyond a handful of names she could not confirm. The church itself, in the meantime, continued its slow decline toward demolition, its roof sagging further with each rainy season, its pews removed to make room for the boxes of paper Evelyn was sorting. A local boy hired to help her carry materials later recalled, in an interview given as an old man decades afterward, that Evelyn would sometimes sit for an hour at a time with the hymn book open on her lap, not reading, simply looking at the stitched pages as though waiting for them to explain themselves. Evelyn's own notebook from this period, portions of which survive in a private family collection, records a growing frustration with the uniformity of certain testimonies and the way they seem to dissolve into vagueness at precisely the same points, regardless of which family offered them. She wrote, in an entry dated to July of that year, that she had begun to suspect the story of the drowning had been handed down like a piece of furniture, kept in good repair because no one wished to look underneath it. In another entry, she described an elderly woman in St. Mercy, identified only by her first name, Odessa, who had agreed to speak with her 3 separate times, each time recounting the drowning story with identical phrasing, before finally, on a 4th visit made without prior notice, her breaking from the rehearsed account entirely and saying only that her own mother had once told her, "The swamp keeps what it's given and gives back what it wants to," a statement Odessa refused to elaborate on afterward, and one Evelyn recorded without further comment of her own. Evelyn also interviewed a retired ferryman, by then in his 80s, who had worked the crossing near St. Mercy since before the war. He told her, according to her notes, that he had carried a great many people across that water over the decades, whose names he had never asked and would not have given even if asked himself. A policy he said his own father had taught him and which he had never had reason to abandon. When Evelyn asked directly whether he had ever heard the name Ruth Cole, he is recorded as saying only that there were a great many Coles on the water, and that he could not speak to any one of them in particular, an answer Evelyn's notes describe as delivered without hesitation and without invitation to ask further. The turning point in Evelyn's investigation came in the late autumn of 1907, when she located a small, water-stained notebook belonging to Thomas Vail, the plantation's former dog handler, who by that time was an elderly man living alone in a small cabin at the edge of the parish, his health failing, his memory, by his own admission to Evelyn, going in pieces. The notebook, given to Evelyn shortly before Vail's death later that same year, contained an account, written in a plain and often halting hand, describing his role on the night of the disappearance. Vail wrote that he had been ordered by Perrin to track and recover the missing woman, and that he had done so with genuine effort at first, believing the matter to be exactly what it appeared. He wrote that he had come, over the following weeks, to believe that Bellwether intended to make him responsible should the hidden papers Ruth had copied ever come to light, a belief he said was confirmed to him indirectly, through a conversation overheard between Bellwether and Perrin, that he did not feel he could reproduce word for word, only that its meaning had been unmistakable to him at the time. According to his own account, Vale had quietly assisted Isaiah Cole in misdirecting the dogs on the night of the disappearance, working alongside a levee labourer whose name he chose not to record even decades later, and had afterward helped circulate, deliberately and at some personal risk, the version of events in which the missing woman had drowned. Evelyn's notes describe her visit to Vale's cabin in some detail, one of the few scenes in her surviving papers rendered with any narrative fullness. She wrote that Vale received her without surprise, as though he had long expected someone to come asking, and that he kept the notebook wrapped in oilcloth inside a tin box beneath his bed, a box he retrieved himself before she could offer to help. He is recorded as saying very little while she read through the pages in his presence, only that he had written it all down, so it wouldn't die with me and leave nothing behind but the dogs coming home wet. When Evelyn asked whether he had ever regretted his part in the matter, Vale is said to have answered that he regretted only how long it had taken him to understand what Bellwether was truly capable of, and that by the time he understood it fully, there was no clean way left to stand apart from it. He died some months after Evelyn's visit, and the notebook remained afterward in her possession. The notebook made clear that the community's long silence on the matter had not been driven solely by fear of the Bellwether family, though Vale wrote that this fear was real and well-founded, and had governed a great deal of what was and was not said in that part of the parish for years afterward. The silence had also functioned over time as a form of protection for a much larger number of people, dozens of adults across several counties who had escaped the same identity-erasing scheme through similar quiet arrangements, and whose continued safety depended on the story never being examined too closely by anyone with the standing to act on what they found. Ruth, the notebook and subsequent testimony confirmed, had survived. Under the name Ruth Cole, a name she had taken, according to testimony gathered from descendants of the Cypress Island communities, from the man who had guided her to safety and later became her husband, she had lived for many years, scattered among the small, semi-hidden settlements built on the higher ground of the Cypress Islands within the swamp, communities that appear in almost no official record of the period, their populations undocumented by any census, their existence known chiefly to the watermen who supplied and traded with them. According to the same descendants' testimony, Ruth's household on the largest of these islands consisted, by the 1870s, of her husband, 2 children, and, for a time, several other adults who had passed through the swamp on their way to more distant safety and chosen for reasons of their own to remain. She is remembered in this testimony as keeping a small wooden box of writing implements salvaged over the years, from discarded ledgers and correspondence traded for at the river landings, and as insisting, gently but consistently, that anyone passing through who was willing should give her their name and any name they had carried before it, so that both could be written down together. One descendant, interviewed in the 1960s, recalled being told that Ruth had once said the swamp could hide a person's body, if it came to that, but it should never be allowed to hide a person's name, and that this distinction had mattered to her more than almost anything else in her life. In this life, Ruth is said to have taken on the responsibility of recording patiently and over decades the histories of those who passed through the region seeking to escape bondage, or, in later years, to reconstruct family connections severed by it. The pages Evelyn found stitched into the hymn book were, it became clear upon comparison with other recovered material, partial copies of a much larger archive, one Ruth had continued to build for the remainder of her life, and which had eventually been sealed inside waterproofed boxes and hidden beneath the floor of an old boat landing station near the swamp's edge, a structure long abandoned by the time Evelyn began her search. When this location was eventually identified and excavated in the final months of Evelyn's investigation, with the help of two men from the Cyprus Island communities who had agreed, after some hesitation, to guide her there, the boxes were found to contain extensive lists, cross-referencing false names against the true identities of the people who had once carried them, along with brief, handwritten notes on where certain individuals or their descendants might later be found. Evelyn's own account of the excavation describes the landing station as little more than a leaning platform of grey, water-softened boards, half swallowed by the surrounding growth, with a narrow cavity beneath the flooring accessible only by lifting two boards that had been deliberately cut to lift free without nails. Inside, the boxes had been sealed with a mixture of pitch and cloth, a method one of her guides said had been used by boatmen for generations to keep tool crates dry through the wet season and had held remarkably well against decades of damp. The paper inside, though softened and browned at the edges, was largely legible, written across what Evelyn estimated to be several different hands and at least 3 distinct periods, suggesting the archive had been maintained continuously for many years after Ruth's own arrival in the swamp communities, quite possibly by others who continued the practice after her. This material allowed a number of families, in the years that followed, to recover names their ancestors had lost generations earlier, names that had been deliberately erased from every official record, but preserved in secret by a woman the county's own ledgers insisted had never existed under that name at all. Independent of the boat landing archive, Evelyn also located, during a final visit to the courthouse before the church's demolition, a probate filing from Nathaniel Bellwether's own estate settlement, drawn up some years after his death, which listed among the family's assets a small parcel of land the executors could not account for in terms of its original purchase, a parcel that, when Evelyn compared its recorded boundaries against an old surveyor's plat, corresponded closely to the stretch of swamp edge nearest the old boat landing station. Whether this was coincidence, or whether some member of the family had at some point understood more about the location than they ever admitted, Evelyn's notes leave an open question, one she wrote she did not expect ever to see closed. Nathaniel Bellwether was never formally charged with any crime related to the scheme Ruth had uncovered. He died in 1894, by all accounts a respected member of the county's social and business community, remembered in his obituary, printed in the regional paper, for his contributions to the local church and his service on the parish levy board. A formal portrait of him remained displayed in the parish courthouse until 1908, when it was quietly removed following the local publication of portions of Evelyn Carter's findings, though the removal itself was never officially explained or recorded in any surviving municipal document, and the portrait's later whereabouts are unknown. Evelyn was able to substantiate the outline of the scheme through the documents she gathered, presenting a summary of her findings first to a sympathetic newspaper editor in a neighboring town, who published a cautious, heavily qualified account of irregularities on the old Bellwether property, omitting most names still connected to living families in the parish. She later presented a fuller version, in a shorter written form, to a regional historical society, whose secretary, according to a letter Evelyn kept for the rest of her life, thanked her for her diligence, while declining to formally endorse or preserve the material, citing in careful language concerns about its effect on relations within the community. Her broader investigation revealed, to her evident dismay, based on the tone of her later correspondence, that a number of local judges, merchants and religious leaders had, in various capacities and to varying degrees, participated in or quietly benefited from the arrangement over the years, a fact that made any formal accounting all but impossible within the political realities of the period. A significant portion of the supporting material Evelyn had assembled, including several of the original ledger pages she had cross-referenced at the courthouse, disappeared from the archive not long after her research became known locally, and no explanation for its loss was ever recorded, nor was any formal inquiry ever opened into its disappearance. Evelyn herself noted in one of her final surviving letters on the subject, written to a cousin in Ohio, that she had come to expect this, and that she considered it, in her own words, a kind of confirmation, the last document any of them were willing to leave behind. The single detail of the case that no one, over the following decades, was ever able to erase or explain away was geographic rather than documentary. For as long as anyone in the region could remember, a narrow channel running near the edge of St. Mercy had been referred to, without any official designation on any survey or county map, as Ruth's Passage. No surviving document accounts for the origin of the name. No chart from before the 1860s includes it. And yet, every boatman working that stretch of the swamp, across at least 3 generations, knew precisely where the channel began and ended, and used the name without hesitation or explanation, as though it required none. In the early 1960s, a folklore researcher working under a modest grant from a regional historical society revisited St. Mercy to catalogue what remained of the community's oral traditions before the last residents with any direct memory of the older stories passed away. Her recorded interviews, later deposited in a small university archive and only partially transcribed even by the time of her death, include several older residents repeating, in fragments and often nearly verbatim, versions of the account Evelyn Carter had assembled half a century earlier, though few of them, when asked directly, could say with any certainty where they had first heard it, or from whom. One recording, according to the archive's own catalogue notes, includes a woman in her 90s who, asked plainly whether the story of the plantation and the missing woman was true, is said to have laughed briefly before answering only that true and told are 2 different things down here, and both of them matter. The researcher also noted in a brief field report dated to 1962 that the original boat landing station where Ruth's hidden archive had been recovered was by then little more than a collapsed frame overtaken by cypress roots, barely distinguishable from the surrounding growth to anyone who did not already know to look for it. She wrote that a local guide had brought her to the spot without hesitation, navigating what appeared to her an entirely unmarked stretch of water, and that when she asked how he knew the place, he answered simply that his father had shown him, and his father's father before that, though none of them, so far as he knew, had ever gone looking for anything there themselves. The surviving boxes and papers recovered from beneath the station's floor had by that time been transferred to storage and partially microfilmed by a regional archive, though a portion of the material was later reported lost, according to a brief internal memorandum following renovations to the building where it had been kept, a memorandum that offered no further detail on what, specifically, had gone missing or how. The old plantation house itself was demolished in the middle years of the same decade to make way for a flood control levee, a project that also required the relocation of the small church where Evelyn Carter had once spent months sorting through a stack of forgotten hymn books. Workers involved in the demolition, according to a brief item in a regional newspaper dated to 1965, reported finding little of particular note beneath the old house's foundation, aside from a scattering of broken glass, a rusted set of shears, and, in one corner of the cellar, a small collection of buttons that no one present could identify as belonging to any particular garment or account for. The foreman overseeing the demolition, quoted briefly in the same article, said only that the crew had been glad to finish the job before the season's first hard rain, and offered no further comment on the house itself. St. Mercy today exists mostly as a name on older maps, its population having dwindled steadily over the course of the 20th century as families moved toward larger towns along the river in search of steadier work. The road that once connected the church, the store, and the ferry landing has been repaved and rerouted twice since the levee project, and little remains along its current path to indicate that either the church or the plantation ever stood where local memory still occasionally places them. The channel still bears its name, unofficial and unrecorded on any current chart, known only to the handful of people who still fish that stretch of water and who, if asked directly, will say only that it has always been called that no one now living remembers exactly why, and that none of them in truth seem especially inclined to ask further. Evelyn Carter herself is recorded as having remained in the region for a number of years after concluding her investigation, continuing to teach and, according to a former student interviewed decades later, occasionally mentioning the case in passing to her classes, though always, by this account, in a way that made you feel she was leaving most of it out on purpose, saving it maybe for someone who'd ask the right question. She is not known to have published a complete account of her findings in her own lifetime, and the bulk of her research, including the hymn book pages and Thomas Vale's notebook, passed eventually to relatives, and from them, over the following decades, into the hands of the Historical Society and, later, the University Archive that also holds the folklore researchers' recordings from the 1960s. Nathaniel Bellwether's name survives in a handful of county records, in the fading entries of a business empire long since dissolved and divided among distant heirs, and in the caption beneath a portrait no one now living has ever seen. Ruth's name survives elsewhere, in the memory of a channel that appears on no official map, in the recovered pages of a hymn book that no congregation ever sang from again, and in the quiet, persistent habit of people who never met her, and who could not always say why, but who continued, generation after generation, to say her name anyway, as though something in the water itself insisted on it.